Thank you very much. And look, it's my absolute pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you, talk with you today about connecting science. I'm absolutely delighted at the theme for this conference about sharing science for better outcomes. It's a fantastic topic and one that's obviously resonated with so many of you here today, and it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you. Perhaps my talk's going to be a little different to some of the others that you're going to be focusing on for the next couple of days. What I'd really like you to think about during my talk is not about me. I might share a little bit of my experience, but I'd really like it to be an opportunity for you to reflect on what place you play in that space of sharing science for better outcomes. The topic of my talk, it's a great concept, but it's not in my job description, budget or busy schedule. Well, you could probably argue for me it is, but I'd like you to think about it from your perspective and whether in fact that is in your job description, whether it is in your busy schedule, and whether you've got some budget that you can play in that space. So it's a fantastic conference over these 3 days to have what I know was originally going to be a 2-day event, expanded to 3, 285 projects, 5 concurrent sessions, and over 1,000 or around 1,000 participants now. So there's something about this topic about sharing science for better outcomes that obviously resonates with you. Everybody's busy people. To come and dedicate a couple of days of your busy year to be able to focus on these issues really shows me that we're not at the starting point of trying to connect science for better outcomes. We're actually a long way down that journey. At the end of the day, it's not about structures, and I think when I look at what's happening here in South Australia with South Australia and the NRM network, there's a fantastic set of connections that already exist here between researchers, between policy people, between the funding bodies as well as the community. And so there's a lot of structure in place that supports that. But it's really the most important thing, and I think Sandy said it before, it's about the people that provide those connections. And sitting here today, you're very much part of those connections. So you're probably sitting here thinking, well, what's your role in this space about connecting science for better outcomes? You could be sitting here as a very practical person that's out as a park ranger. Perhaps you're one of the people in the department might be working on a range of policy issues. That's where your expertise lies. And so you're a user of research quite directly. You could be involved in grants administration or an NRM manager. There's lots of different places we fit in. And perhaps for you, when you think about it, maybe you don't fit into one of those individual categories. You might actually fit into a number of them. And in different parts of the work that you do, you might operate at different levels and different capacities. So I guess for the next 20 minutes or so that we've got left, you've no doubt got a whole pile of things that are running around in your mind about what your normal day job involves. You might be thinking about budgets. We're getting to that time of year when people start thinking about the budgets for next year, how you're travelling for this year. You've got staffing, resources, and it doesn't matter whether you work in government or whether you're in a practical organisation out on the ground doing work. We've all got millions of things on our minds. So I'd ask you to just try and put those aside for the moment and focus on your role in connecting science and policy and for better outcomes. So I've sort of characterised here that there's 4 broad areas: research, policy, grant administration and management. Of course, those things aren't unique. They're not completely separate, but I think it is important to recognise that there are different perspectives that come across depending on where you fit into the process of connecting science and where you want to share science. At the very top, at the centre, there I've got science communications and knowledge brokering. And I think that's something that we all share some responsibility for and some opportunities. The one thing I would encourage you to think about, if you're in an organisation where you're very fortunate enough to have some specialist knowledge brokers or communicators, and the sort of work that Jenny does here in South Australia, I'd really encourage you to get behind those people and support them and use their expertise for your daily work. I'm quite lucky in my position with the Commonwealth Government that I sit in the centre of that space. One of the roles that we have is managing a number of research programs, the biggest of which, as Sandy just mentioned before, is the National Environmental Science Program. which provides about $142.5 million over 6 years to 6 consortiums of research organisations which are spread across the states and different partners from government, from university, state government as well as Commonwealth. It's a fantastic program to have a minister at the Commonwealth level that's so supportive of that fund. It's quite a tight time, as everybody knows, for getting funding for research, and we're very fortunate that he's been very supportive behind that. And one of the things that sort of really encourages me in that role is our Minister sees that as a national program. So while it's funded by the Commonwealth Environment Department with Commonwealth government funding, he sees very much the benefit of that being for national outcomes. So the parallel, I guess, for you to think about wherever you fit in is the research that you're doing, it may have a very local relevance, or perhaps it's a statewide relevance, or perhaps even a national relevance. And it's great to see people thinking in that space where we're not focused on those immediate boundaries around where we operate, but thinking more broadly. The National Environmental Science Program follows on from a couple of programs you might have heard before. There was a National Environmental Research Program prior to that, and the Commonwealth Environment Research Facilities Program. But my team back in Canberra looks after a couple of other programs. Australia Climate Change Science Program, which is being rolled into the National Environmental Science Program this year. We also look after the NRM Stream 2 Planning for Climate Change. And I know there's quite a number of people here at the conference and a couple of presentations which are very much tapped into that work. From a research point of view, maybe that's where you fit in. Maybe that's where your perspective is. You might be sitting in a research institution, actually doing some research. From my team's point of view, we deal with a couple of Australian government organisations. So there's the Australian Antarctic Division Supervising Scientists branch, which is up in Darwin looking after the uranium mine, the Ranger uranium mine, and the Office of Water Science, which does a lot of work which connects with quite a number of people in different states, including South Australia. And we also have direct contact with a bunch of people in state government research organisations. And over on the right, there's a bunch of acronyms that many of you are probably aware of. Australian, the Atlas of Living Australia, TERN, IMOS, Geoscience Australia, CSIRO, Australian Institute of Marine Science. So you'll know where you fit into that picture, and maybe you're in one of those groups, or maybe you've already got fantastic connections right across that network. We're quite fortunate that the scope of the National Environmental Research Program, National Environmental Science Program, is quite broad, and the application of the research there is not just about better outcomes for the environment per se, but we work with colleagues right across Commonwealth Government, including agriculture, water, Australian parks, as well as we've got connections with people in the Prime Minister's and Cabinet area that look after Indigenous policy. And I think if you think about the work that you're doing, wherever it fits in, there may be connections with broader parts of government that you haven't already thought about. Or maybe you're sitting in a management agency, and whatever that is, whether it's an NRM organisation, or whether it's part of a government program, or you're out there actually on the ground in some kind of a agricultural business. Maybe that's where you fit in, and you have your own perspectives and your own needs for research. So just thinking about that broader framework, what is it that you do on a daily basis that you can do to help share science? Coming along to the conference like this is obviously a really fantastic opportunity in lots of ways, but there are different things that we can all do from our different perspectives. And I'll just give a bit of an unashamed plug here for the NRM Rain newsletter that Jenny puts out every Sunday. Does a lot of hard work. I know she's having a 2-week break, so don't look for it for the next 2 weeks. But if you're not already connected to that newsletter, I'd certainly encourage you to get on there. Give a little plug for the Chirp, which is a little e-newsletter that my team back in Canberra puts out once a week, and that covers some key things that are coming out of the National Environmental Science Program, as well as a short snippet on a couple of other initiatives that are happening at the Commonwealth Government level. There's lots of newsletters and we can all get swamped with emails completely, but the thing that those, as two really good examples are things that if you subscribe, you can get the weekly email, just have a quick scan through, see if there's anything that's relevant there. You don't have to spend a lot of time, they're only a couple of pages long, but it is a great way of helping share in that science that's around and out there. Also, just give a really quick plug for the Climate Change in Australia website, which is one of the products from our Preparing for Climate Change Stream 2 program. And that website, if you're not familiar with it, it's got a fantastic bunch of resources for wherever you fit into that space if you want to know a bit more about the practical implications and projections, future projections of climate for Australia. Well, there's a few things we can all do, and it doesn't matter whether you're a researcher, a policy person, or whether you're a funder. Some of the things we can do, and I'd encourage you to do, are to get in and start that conversation early with all of the other people involved in this space. So whether it's, if you're a researcher, have a chat to some policy people, get involved with the funders and find out what's motivating them in their next round of funding. It's a bit of history, I suppose, that researchers have sat back and been waiting for the funding dollars to come out and then think about how do you engage with end users of that research. But I think the time has definitely moved on and there's a lot of momentum, and the place where we're getting really good connections are with researchers and policy people that see those connections, have the discussion well before the funding is put on the table, and that leads to really good outcomes. So it's not only starting early, but it's expanding your networks. And while you're at the conference here, if you're from whichever sector you fit in, you might not know too many about the department people here in South Australia that are working on policy issues. You might only have met one or two, only know a couple of names. And I'd really encourage you for the rest of the conference to actually pick out some of those people and try and have a discussion, start a bit of a relationship that you can have some ongoing dialogue with them. And I think one of the key things to think about is your different perspectives. Be aware that your perspective, wherever you fit in, is quite likely to be different from somebody else. If somebody else is working on a policy space, you might think there's a lot of commonality about the issue, but others probably have a very different perspective. And keeping your eyes and ears open to be receptive to hearing those other perspectives is really good. One of the things that we're fortunate, I guess in my space back in Canberra, is that providing funding. Funding is a really powerful catalyst for connecting science with better outcomes, and there's a lot of things you can do in that space. I'll come back to that in just a second. So if for example, you're in the space where you're actually involved in a grants, a research funding cycle, or maybe you're in a NRM organisation that particularly wants a bit of research done, and you're looking at going out and procuring a bit of research. So it might be a one-off, or it could be a more generic thing as part of a funding program. Some of the things you can do to help share the science and get those better outcomes is to set clear research priorities from the word go. If you're clear about what the research is you're looking for, that will go a long way to getting better outcomes at the end. Designing projects. So in the whole process of providing funding, don't just leave it to the researchers to design the projects in isolation, but be involved and require collaboration throughout that cycle. If you set clear expectations about engagement and collaboration as part of your research funding guidelines, then it can go away and be very empowering for the researchers who are looking to actually engage. It gives a mandate and a bit of authority for them to be involved in that space if it is a clear expectation of funding. One of the things you can really do as administering grants is embracing Indigenous knowledge. When we heard this morning some fantastic examples about how Indigenous perspectives and knowledge is not just a resource to be tapped into for research, but can really add value if you can make those connections and find out how to involve people. In providing funding, to get really good outcomes, better outcomes than what you would otherwise, it really helps if you can articulate what is the path to impact. So if you can draw out and show those links as part of your funding arrangement, that will help ensure you get better links. And one of the other things you can do as a funder is to require that the outputs of the research, particularly if it's publicly funded, should be publicly and freely available. And I was really encouraged to hear Minister Hunter's comment this morning about I think the words he used were look for unexpected uses of your data, which I thought was really good. And you know, when you stop and think about your perspective in setting a research project up, quite often you don't, you know why you're collecting the data for your purposes, but actually stopping and thinking about, well, what's some unexpected uses of that data? And the only way you can really get into that space of thinking about unexpected uses is if you're having a dialogue with other people that have a different perspective to yourself. We're fortunate under the National Environmental Science Program that we have very clear guidelines for data requirements for data and information to be made freely and publicly available. And if you wanted to jump in and have a look at those, they're on our website at environment.gov.au. So if you're working in the policy space and perhaps you're here involved in one of the departments, I think one of the key things you can do to help get better outcomes from sharing science is to really be clear about what your information needs are. Quite often, and this is a challenge for us in our department back in the environment in Canberra, when we talk to people in different areas of the department about research and what their needs are, sometimes that's it's an early opportunity for them. They don't normally have the time set aside on a daily basis to think about their research needs and what their information needs are. So as a policy person, if that's something you can think about, well, research, well, we've got a gap here, we've got an information need, and then you can think about where you could prioritise research to help fill those gaps. And that's something you can do in your own space from a policy perspective to start the conversation with others. And the other thing I'd really encourage you, if you're involved from a policy perspective, is to really embed yourself in the research. So don't just be involved at the start and hear there's a project going and somebody's doing something that might be relevant, but I'd really encourage you to keep up the contact with them and sort of push yourself into the relationship and expect to be kept involved and engaged throughout the cycle. If you happen to be working in a management organisation, perhaps a practical thing out on the ground where you're spending most of your time, again, starting that research dialogue early with the researchers is a great way to get at the ground level to getting research that will meet your needs. Again, a bit like for the policy people I just mentioned, sort of demand with the researchers and with the funders that you need to be involved in the research, that you expect to be involved and you expect to be engaged. And it's not a nice little thing at the end of the day if the researcher's got time to have a chat to you, you actually expect to be involved. And from a management point of view, one of the things that you can really do that will help is if you can ask the tough questions about, well, so what from this research? I think it's pretty clear we've got fantastic researchers right across Australia doing really good work. There's lots of good ideas out there just waiting to be implemented, but the difficulty is prioritising those and getting the funding for particular projects. And what you can really help do if you're a manager is being really clear about asking researchers and putting the asset on them at the time and the funders to say, what is the outcome of your research? It's not just going to be better information for better decisions, but try and articulate exactly if we've run this project, how will that help us with our policy or our management needs? Okay. So if you're a researcher, I think we've already picked up on a couple of things. The key thing, I guess I'd say for a researcher is see that any of the obligations that are reflected to you from your funding body, don't see them as shackles, don't see them as requirements, as obligations, but really see them as opportunities and really embrace the aspect of collaboration. And listening to managers, funders and policy people, just hearing what their perspective is something that you can really do as well. All right, a couple of really quick suggestions, and look, some of these you're probably already doing, but a couple of things if you haven't thought about it. Maybe when you go back from this conference, you go back to your team, whatever your team makeup is, you might have a weekly meeting, maybe just have a 5-minute brainstorming session with your team about how you can more effectively share science. So what's some of the ideas that have come out of attending this workshop that you think you can implement? You don't have to sit round and sort of have anything formal and prioritise them or anything else, but just share those ideas, and you never know, there may be one of those that sort of resonates with your team and you might be able to follow through on. Get somebody along to your next meeting with a different perspective. So if you're in a research organisation, maybe get one of the people that you've met at the conference from the policy area, just invite them along to your next team meeting to give a bit of an update on what things are like from their perspective. What are the issues and what are their needs and drivers? We've already talked about the NRM newsletter. I think if you can flick that around to other people. You have a look, you see there's an article or there's a bit of research in there, you think, oh, maybe that's interesting, maybe it's got an application in another way to what it was originally intended. Flick it on to somebody else and encourage a bit more broader discussion about it. And I think where you've got examples of how science has supported better decisions, actually really get out there and promote that. Quite often we sort of move on from our successes, I think. So at the end of all this, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, my job description doesn't have any of this stuff in there. I don't really have a budget to do it, and I don't really have the time. And I could have framed this talk very differently and structured it around all the barriers to effective communication of science and better uptake. And there's been plenty of those sort of talks in the past. But I'm actually very optimistic that there's lots of goodwill, there's lots of expertise, and the opportunity is there for us all to be involved, regardless of what's in our job description, our budget or our busy schedule. The opportunities are there and it's up to us to make the most of them. So thank you and all the best for a wonderful conference.